Hi everyone, a few people have asked me to talk more about axes. Obviously there's a lot that could be said about axes. What I'm holding here is a 19th century, probably, may possibly be 18th, but probably 19th century Indian bullover as they're known. I don't know how you pronounce it correctly. Bullover axe, an original antique one, and they have this characteristic blade that looks like a comedy moustache there. So I'm just holding this as an example of an axe, you know, there are some features to talk about, but people have asked lots of random sort of questions about axes. So a few things, I'll just come out with a few random facts and opinions that I've got on axes. First of all, the good things about axes are that they're cheap to make. I reckon even with rudimentary blacksmith skills and a forge, I could make an axe in a few hours fairly easily, and probably most of you could. Fairly obviously it wouldn't be a very glamorous axe unless you're a skilled blacksmith, but you can make a functional axe very easily, and you don't need very good quality iron or steel to be able to do so. So they're cheap to make, that's the first thing. Second really good thing about axes is they hit really hard, because they're not nimble, really. They're all of that. If you look at the balance point, and this is a genuine 19th century axe, there you go, the balance point is practically at the head. Okay, so they're not particularly nimble weapons like a sword or even a spear, but clearly they have a lot of momentum in their hitting end, and therefore they're going to hit with a lot of force. And for this reason, axes gained quite a lot of popularity, for example, in the sort of 12th to 14th century particularly, when there was a lot of mail worn in Europe, and you know, impact weapons are very useful, and shields were in use of course, and axes are good at maybe smashing up shields or hooking them out of the way. In fact the axe kind of came back again in the later 14th and 15th century in the form of the poleaxe, the long-handled version, for fighting in armour, because it hits with a lot of force of course, because you've got weight at the hitting end. So it's cheap to make, it hits with a lot of force. Some disadvantages, well, clearly you've got a wooden, in most cases you've got a wooden shaft and no hand protection. So generally speaking, if you're fighting against people who have maybe got swords and you're not wearing armour, you're not wearing gauntlets, just as a basic hand weapon, your hands are going to be very vulnerable, and to a certain extent the shaft of the weapon is going to be somewhat vulnerable, and you might find that, you know, if you're fighting against people using swords and such like, chunks are going to get taken out of the wooden shaft, and at some point the weapon might become unserviceable. And for that very reason, this is why battle axes and pole axes of some sorts had languettes, as they're called, iron splints essentially, down the shaft to help protect them. But hand vulnerability, I would say, is a big factor with any of these kind of short pole weapons. Another interesting thing about the axe is, whilst you can use it somewhat similarly to a one-handed sword to an extent, like a sort of more like a falchion, I suppose, or a messer, a more unbalanced or top-heavy one-handed sword, it does have some features which a sword doesn't have, and one of the obvious ones is the ability to hook. Okay, and catching things under here, or indeed on here, and we know both were done from, I'll explain in a second, but catching things above or below here, it can be quite a useful thing, because it's something you can do with this weapon that you can't necessarily do with many other types of weapon, except for certain types of polearm. The hook on the underneath can, of course, if for example you swung the axe at someone and they blocked it with their weapon, you can of course then pull their weapon towards you, either to pull them off balance or pull their weapon out of the way in order to open them up for a follow-up attack. Or indeed, if you're fighting against people with shields, having the ability, and you can do this also with warhammers, not so much with maces, but having the ability to get the edge of your weapon over the shield and then pull the shield down, really big advantage, really good thing. But equally, and this is perhaps less appreciated, unless you've looked at the Bolognese pole weapon, sources, for example Manciolino and Marozzo, is that this top crook can also be used for things defensively as well, or indeed just for pushing. And if you look at some of the poleaxe sources, and certainly the Bolognese polearm sources, for example the Partisan and Spiedo and so on, you'll know that this part can be used both for parrying incoming attacks, or indeed if someone's using a pole weapon, for example, say you've got a spear thrust coming at you here, you can actually catch and push aside with this crook at the end. So it's another interesting feature of the thing. And of course, if you have an axe which has a spike or a hammer on the backside, it gives you an even bigger sort of fork to catch and push things away with. So there we go, there's a few initial thoughts about axes. I'm sure I'll say more about them at some point. But clearly they were, you know, widespread for various reasons, not just because they were cheap to produce, because many battle axes were in fact very expensive examples and very high status, but because they have qualities as a weapon which you don't get from a sword. The fact that you've got this projecting head and the fact that it hits with a lot of force at the hitting end. Thank you.